Welcome to Lecture 3, Ishihara Shintaro's Season of Violence. Today's lecture will focus on the scandalous novel from 1956 and how it represents certain trends in youth, politics, literature, and post-war angst. As you see below, Taiyo no Kisetsu, or Season of Violence, was made into a film, and we'll also discuss the relationship between literature and film. As always, I'd like to start with a summary. And again, here above you see stills from the 1956 film version. You may have heard of Tokyo Governor Ishihara Shintaro. He was governor of Tokyo until 2012, and we'll discuss that too. Some things that we'll discuss is the original title is Seasons of the Sun, or Taiyo meaning sun, Kisetsu meaning season. Do you think the English title, Season of Violence, is a better fit? And a warning, dear class, I don't say that condescendingly. I find this story heartbreakingly cruel, and I'm sorry to make you read it. It's just too important of a story, and it is very well written for us to skip. But if you're a sensitive reader, I hope these images won't haunt you. You might read it and say, it's really not so bad. And in some ways, I hope you do feel this way. And we'll talk about in this class why it's important to read stories that sort of shock us into our humanity. Why would we leave the cockroaches, our question for week 1? Literature that sees the evil or the bad sides of human beings. We'll also talk about, as every lecture, the context, the historical context, the literary content, the stuff in the story, the literary form, how the story is written, the author, especially here because the author is so famous for politics too, and the significance. Speaking of significance, Season of Violence was a story that really changed Japanese literature in the 1950s. It was a complete game changer, and it presented a certain vision of youth culture that hadn't been depicted in Japanese literature before, arguably. There had been stories of some other bad youths, but this was revolutionary in many respects. We'll talk about one of the most prestigious literary prizes in Japan, the Akutagawa Prize, which Season of Violence won in 1956. And if you notice, I keep repeating 56 because the publication of the novel was, and the film came out the same year. And Ishihara was sort of a master of using media to promote his works. And it is no coincidence that these were released the same year. And the Season of Violence started a trend for what was called Taiyozoku, or Sun Tribe, films and novels. And all of the novels were written by Ishihara Shintaro. So Taiyo again meaning sun, and we will talk about sun tribes. Please also read a very short article from Time magazine that was published in the United States in 1956 that reports on how scandalous the Sun Tribe was and how it was a shock internationally about how Japanese youths are behaving this way. The short Time magazine article also reads this form of Japanese youth culture as part of being part of a rise of global youth culture, other kinds of bad youth, if you will, rising up in Paris, London. James Dean films came out in, around the same time. In fact, James Dean, the American actor, died in 1956, the same year that Season of Violence was published. So Season of Violence was controversial in the 1950s, and both the novel and the film, or the novella and the film, encouraged debate about youth culture. Ishihara later became the governor of Tokyo, and Ishihara's younger brother, Ishihara Yujiro, starred in the film version and in real life married the actress Kitahara Mie, who played Eiko. So as always, I'd like to start with historical context, and I do so because it helps us to understand what the story is reacting to. Again, our class covers This is an iconic or very famous photograph from right after the war. This is a photograph that was taken between General MacArthur, the head of the occupation government, and Emperor Hirohito, who became known posthumously after his death as the Showa Emperor. His time period was the Showa period. The emperors are not called by their reign names. Like we don't call the emperor now the Reiwa emperor. After he dies officially, he'll be called the Reiwa emperor, but they're known by their emperor plus their given name. But they had a meeting in September 1945, and this photo represented to many Japanese people at the time the idea that they had lost the war. Like, for example, just take a few seconds and look at this photo. How is General MacArthur standing? What kind of uniform is he wearing? And I'll answer that he's not wearing a dress uniform. He's wearing sort of his everyday military uniform. How is the emperor standing? The emperor looks a bit more uncomfortable. And the emperor is wearing what's called a morning suit, or a very formal attire that contrasts to General MacArthur's casual military clothing. So this photo sort of represents not only like Americans as being more casual, that's not the main part. The main part is MacArthur looks so much at ease and he's so tall and imposing, where the emperor looks formal and uncomfortable. And this sort of shows sort of a power dynamic in the popular imagination in the media when this photograph circulated. An image that instead represents the time period that we're reading in the story, one of many images. We could circulate many images that represent the 1950s, and I included some on the slides. But as I mentioned, in mid-1950s Japan, the idea of owning a television was a symbol of having a good middle-class life, and television sets were extremely expensive. If you're interested, again, I could post some materials about how people watch television, but usually there would be one television set that many people in a neighborhood would gather around to watch in a public place, like in a window of a department store. But one of the first television broadcasts was actually a boxing match, wrestling. Boxing's in our story. But sporting events had a power in the 1950s when they were entertaining. They were also some of the first television broadcasts because it's easy to place a single camera and film the event rather than having multiple cameras as in a staged drama. But in this wrestling match, as you see in this photograph, one of the wrestlers was a resident Korean. Now, this is a very famous match, too, that represents popular culture of the 1950s. If you're looking for a really good film to watch, I recommend famous director Ozu Yasujiro's Good Morning, or Ohayo. And it's about two children in the 1950s that want their parents to buy them a television. Other images from around the time period of Ishihara's Season of Violence. Here again, I mentioned before, is Tokyo Tower. It's still there. It's actually one of my favorite buildings. I just have this thing for Tokyo Tower. I just really love it. But it looks sort of like the Eiffel Tower, but it was a radio broadcast tower. It's still in Tokyo, and you can see this is an aerial photograph that was taken in 1961. That the area around Tokyo now is highly built up, and it's it was near, Tokyo Tower was actually near Roppongi, which is a place where the American military lived in the 1950s. That major event in the 1960s that represent Japan's recovery, if you will, was the 1964 Olympics. And if you're interested, we could talk about the role of Olympics in literature and how Olympics represent a sense of national pride, which is relevant to the year 2020 with the 2020 Tokyo Olympics, now in 2021. If you're looking for another good film to watch, I recommend the film Always, Sanchome no Yuhi. This is a film that was made in 2005, but it is set in the time of our story, around 1956, 1957, and it focuses on the daily lives of people in Tokyo who are very different from the members of the Sun Tribe, the characters in Ishihara's story. But one character in the film is really trying to win the Akutagawa Literary Prize. A few more aspects of the historical context relevant to our literary discussion. There were also changes in the notion of the post-war family and what family meant to Japanese society and politics. In other words, there was a division of gendered labor, this idea of the man as, especially like the characters in our story, the brothers, Tatsuya and Michihisa, go to elite universities. These are youth that are supposed to grow up and become elite businessmen like their father, which makes the story even more scandalous because it shows that these elite students are not hitting the books and studying and doing what they're supposed to be doing. They're actually, out partying, listening to jazz music, having a lot of sex, whatnot. But the family was sort of promoted as a way that life can be conducted in the post-war period in which everybody has a job to do. This idea of productivity. It's not that women did not work. Women have always worked, both inside and outside of the home, throughout Japanese history. But in the 1950s, we have more of a division of labor that the middle-class woman was theoretically supposed to be a housewife, in part because if you've ever operated an old washing machine, it's not so easy. You don't just put the clothes in and they, put the detergent in and they wash. It takes a lot of work to do all this housework. Like somebody has to do it. It's just a lot of labor involved. That's one part of it. Also, it became more difficult for women to have the same kind of employment as men did outside the home. Employment structures become divided that men are more full-time workers for a company, and women are considered more fungible part-time workers. Let's save that thought because we have images of women in labor in some stories coming up in the coming weeks. But we do see in the father in the story a representation of what's called a salaryman, or a Japanese businessman. And we also at this time see a need in Japan for more babies. Japan had lost a lot of people during the war. And there is promotions in many media discourses about the rise of the nuclear family, meaning the father, mother, and theoretically 2 children living together in their own home. Also part of the 1950s, not everyone was super happy, but there was a general sense of optimism that if Japan could survive the war and then prosper economically, anything could be possible. So one more part of our historical picture or our historical context is the global rise of youth culture. And what we see represented in the Season of Violence is a new generation of youth that's different from their parents. It's implied in this and other stories that the parents have direct memories of the war. Again, Tatsuya and Ishihara are college age. They're probably in their young 20s in the story, and the story was written in 1956. So they were young children during the war. But their parents had more direct memories of the suffering and atrocities committed during the war. And you can think about in Season of Violence how Tatsuya treats his father. He doesn't really treat his father very well. And so not all youth are represented as good people. Some are. I could recommend, if you'd like, some stories of some very positive representations of 20-year-olds. But youth culture and this rise of youth culture was both celebrated and scorned. It was celebrated as something very progressive and new. Again, if Japan can survive the war and then economically prosper, then anything could be possible. And youth culture represented that optimism. It was scorned because there were sort of conservative discourses that, like, what's happening with youth today? They lack values, or they don't do the thing, they have too much privilege, or what's going to happen to Japan's future if all 20-year-olds acted like Tatsuya and Ishihara? What's going to happen to Japan then? So the youth represented in the Season of Violence are different from other representations of youth and sexuality. The story was scandalous too because we have more overt depictions of sex. Not that stories would be censored only for sexuality in Japan, and you couldn't go full-blown and really, no pun intended, my apologies, you couldn't really get explicit in literary works, and there were some 20th century literary trials where authors were put on trial for writing pornography and then put in prison. And if you're interested in this, I can give you more information about famous trials among authors. For example, a famous Japanese writer named Nagai Kafu was put on trial, as were translations, like the translation of D.H. Lawrence literary works were considered too scandalous to be published in Japan. And if you'd like to learn more, again, I could give you information about Japan's obscenity codes. But Taiyo no Kisetsu, or Season of Violence, was still within what was publishable at the time. But here we see associations, for example, of sexuality and violence. But one thing that sort of irks at me when I read this story is, why do all women like Eiko have to be bad for a reason? Why can't she just be bad, like Tatsuya's bad, just for the hell of it, if you will? Why does she have to have a backstory that something made her bad? So contextually, globally, we have books, films, and other media about youth. Like, as I mentioned, James Dean died in 1956, the year that Season of Violence was published. And J.D. Salinger wrote Catcher in the Rye in the 1940s, but it was published as a novel in 1951, a few years before Season of Violence. Again, youth, a double-edged sword, potential for a fresh future, but also that kind of fear of, what is this future? What's going to happen if all youth act this way? If you're interested, there have been other influential literary works on Japanese youth culture. For example, I don't know if any of you have read S.E. Hinton's The Outsiders, which was an extremely influential American novel from, I think, 1967. And the 1983 film was popular in Japan and helped shape Tokyo youth culture as pictured here, especially in a neighborhood called Shibuya. The Season of Violence was so scandalous and so powerful and so new that it made global media. And please do read that Time magazine article from 1956. I'm not going to read it all out loud to you, but I just picked out 2 quotes that stand out to me. And do read the whole thing because you'll gain a lot out of it, and it's an interesting short read. But you could see in the top quote that the American reporter contextualizes the Japanese youth generation coming 15 years after Pearl Harbor, again, American reference to the war, and being physically taller than their elders, having a better diet, growing up in a more, an easier time, but also being tempestuous and troubled. The author equates the Japanese rising youth to different movements like what's going on with the Teddy Boys in post-war London, or the fans of Elvis Presley in the United States. But I will read you part of the second quote, or at the end. The first part, sort of that whole idea of a whole generation of Japanese youngsters whose only wish is to kick over the traces. As the most talked about youngster in modern Japan, 24-year-old Shintaro Ishihara has every right to act as a spokesman for his generation. Not yet a year out of college, he's already known as a composer, painter, a movie star whose haircut and clothes are ardently aped by teenagers from Tokyo to Nagasaki, and the most sensationally successful author in the nation, with 4 best-selling novels to his credit. Beyond all this, Ishihara is the idol and godhead of a flamboyant and far-flung cult whose youthful excesses have caused Japan's oldsters to shake their heads in horror and despair. This is the cult of the Taiyozoku, the Sun Tribers, the flaming youth of modern Japan. Again, before we get into the Taiyozoku, or these new youth of Japan, please keep in mind that people did not live like the youth of Ishihara Shintaro's stories. There's a difference between representation and reality. And it's also important to keep in mind that this is also the rise of a very violent time. Especially student protests are growing in the 1950s and 1960s. Pictured left is the Zengakuren student activist movement, fighting against, for example, the U.S.-Japan Security Treaty, or AMPO, first in 1951. And I put the book cover here of a famous Japanese author. I wish we had time to read OA in this class, but sadly we don't. This is a translation of a novel called 17. This is an English translation that includes 2 novels, 17 and J. J's a separate novel. But 17 is based on a true incident of a right-wing 17-year-old boy, if you will, who murdered a woman at a socialist rally. And the story tells of this boy's perspective. Oe himself was not a right-wing supporter, and he casts the boy's rationale in some very sexualized ultranationalist terms. And it's a novel well worth reading, especially against things we'll talk about next week when we discuss Mishima Yukio. So I hope that makes sense in terms of historical context. Let's keep putting the pieces together, and as we do, let me add another piece, again, our author. former Tokyo Governor Ishihara Shintaro. And this is the official photo from his Tokyo Governor website. He's no longer governor. He was governor for a long time, from 1999 to 2012. Ishihara wrote around 5 best-selling books, and he considers himself to be both a politician and a literary figure. He first served in the Diet, and the Diet's like the Japanese bicameral legislature. It has a legislature with 2 halves. But he served in the Diet for 25 years until 1995, and he entered politics in the 1960s at a time where other authors or figures were sort of entering in politics, not just because they were authors, they had something to say and wanted to initiate changes. To give you another example, I don't know if any of you have seen the heartbreaking Studio Ghibli anime, Grave of the Fireflies. But Grave of the Fireflies was based on an autobiographical novel that was written by an author who also became a politician in the 1960s. But since the 1950s, Ishihara has promoted himself as the image of the masculine athlete. For example, he lists his hobbies on his old Tokyo Metropolitan Governor website as scuba diving, sailing, and tennis. And sailing plays a major role in a lot of his novels, especially expensive boats. He's also visited the North Pole. He likes expensive boats, again, yachting. More about his politics later. First is literature. Ishihara was born in Zushi, which is the setting for Season of Violence. And if you notice at the bottom right, this is a monument. If you go to the beach at Zushi, and this is about an hour and a half outside of Tokyo by train, this is a monument to the story we're reading. You can think the story is so important that it has a monument, and it's commemorating the writing of the story. So Ishihara, and I provided a map, you could see how Zushi relates to Tokyo. It's a doable commute. But it's a very affluent area. As we read in the story, we see people living in big houses, a foreign influence, wealthy foreigners in the time of the story. So Season of Violence, again, Taiyo no Kisatsu, the Japanese title being Season of the Sun, won the 1956 Akutagawa Prize. The Akutagawa Prize is Japan's most prestigious literary award. And I'll tell you more about that in our next slide. The award was given 2 months before Ishihara graduated from college. Technically, that would be very difficult because many, especially before this time, if you published a literary work while you were a student, many schools frowned upon this. And there were authors, for example, from the pre-war period that had to drop out of school in order to publish literature. But Ishihara won this award in part because Season of Violence was so new and shocking. And the Akutagawa Prize goes to literature that's going to change new trends and shape new trends in Japanese literary writing. It had a strong impact on the literary world, and it encouraged a lot of debates. So not only did many elite authors at the time who chose this story to win this prize, not only did they think it told a good story, they liked Ishihara's literary form and his mode of expression. The story changed the Japanese literary world. It changed the image of literary prizes. Here's a prize going to a young university student who's really represents a new idea of masculinity. We see Ishihara here in the photo on a yacht, or a sailboat rather, with his scandalously short cropped hair. And he made Hawaiian shirts popular. It also changed book publishing. It set the pace for other novellas about youth culture. I know our story seems short at about 23 translated pages, but it was considered a novella, or danpen shosetsu, a short novel in Japanese. And many Japanese literary works, perhaps good for you as students, are short because they're first published in magazines. The translation we're reading was translated in 1961. And I don't know how you feel about that. I don't know if you found some of the vocabulary to be a bit dated. Like, for example, one character doesn't say, "You're being rude to me." They say, "You're being imprudent," which gives it sort of an affluent edge, too. But Ishihara Shintaro became an instant celebrity after writing Season of Violence. And again, he represented this new kind of author-filmmaker celebrity, and we'll talk about the films in a few minutes. and a new kind of man. Again, these photos they seem normal to us now in the 21st century, but put yourself back in the 1950s. Again, Japan had recently lost the war. This is a very different image of affluence. And along with his brother Yujiro, he represented what became known as the Sun Tribe, or Taiyozoku. Before we meet the Sun Tribe, let me just give you a little information about the Akutagawa Prize. We will read at least one more writer in our class that has won the Akutagawa Prize, and I'll let that be a suspense for you. It's not Mishima. I'll double check that. I don't think it is. I may need to eat my own words, but I don't think so. Mishima has his own literary prize now, the Mishima Prize. But anyhow, the Akutagawa Prize is the most prestigious literary award in Japan, and it's given out every year since 1935, or almost every year. There have been years without prizes, in part due to economic circumstances, but often because the prize committee can't agree on a set winner. But most years it's given out twice a year, January and July. And it's given to a work of so-called serious literature, or what's known as Jun Bungaku. And I'm sorry for forgetting to write the Japanese characters or kanji, but Jun meaning literally like pure. Bungaku meaning literature. Season of Violence is considered elite literature, even though it does seem scandalous. Elite literature doesn't mean literature that doesn't have sex scenes and violence. As we know, as readers, a lot of so-called canonized works have a lot of violence and sexuality. But a serious literature means in the modes in which it was published. The Akutagawa Prize, goes to a literary work that was published in a literary magazine that year. That's another reason for the lengths of these stories. But the Akutagawa Prize was established in 1935 in the memory of the man you see with the first man to the left with his hand on his chin. That's Akutagawa Ryunosuke, who committed suicide in 1927. The prize was established by a famous editor in 1935 named Kikuchi Kan, both to sell magazines and to shape the literary world. Like, people would want to buy a magazine that had a prize-winning story. The Akutagawa Prize is not given to someone who has published a lot. It's given to a new up-and-coming writer who shows the promise of a successful literary career. And it often goes to a writer who represents something about their historical context or their historical times. The winner, it's a great prize to get because you get publicity, you get 1,000,000 yen, and you get a watch. And here you see a picture of what the watch looks like. Gets a lot of attention. Your work gets more advertising, and it recirculates again in the magazine, and it also has an easier time coming out as a book. How it's decided now is a committee of authors and they narrow down a list of works to about, I'm not quite sure how many. I could assume it's probably less than 10 of stories that have been published that year. And then they vote, and they rate them. And so sometimes it's not if there's 5 committee members, it might not be the work that won top prize among all committee members if someone really ranks it low. Sometimes it's the compromise work that wins. If you're interested, there is a sibling prize that's given called the Naoki Prize. And this is a prize for so-called popular literature, or Taishu Bungaku. Taishu literally meaning mass, or like masses of people. And it was named after Naoki Sanjugo, and you see him in the middle figure. Again, why do these authors always pose with like their hands on their chins? To give you a sense, the Akutagawa Prize gives the writer a lot of publicity. Some Akutagawa Prize winners have been more famous than others, and Ishihara Shintaro is one of the most famous. Another highly discussed writer was a man who won in 2015 named Matayoshi Naoki. And he won for a work called Hibana, or Spark, and he was one of the first TV comedians to win. Sadly, he was a co-winner. I mean, that's not sad. I'm really happy for the other author who won, but he doesn't get as much discussion about him. It was Matayoshi who got all the spotlight. But again, the authors are posed here with their works, and the third person's the person who won the Naoki Prize. But a lot of their historical works react to youth at their time. Other writers who won the Akutagawa Prize that were highly discussed were a set of 2 women writers, Kanehara Hitomi and Wataya Risa. Lastly, in 2018, there was a bit of a literary scandal, and this is relevant to our discussion later this term, that one of the novels that was a nominee for the prize was actually found to be plagiarized. Not taking words directly from another novel, but drawing so heavily on news sources about the March 11th triple disaster of earthquake, tsunami, and nuclear meltdown, that it was found to be too similar to a nonfiction text that was published, which is a good lesson for us to always cite your sources. Be careful. Don't pass off things that are your own when they're not your own. And the publisher had to issue an apology. So Ishihara won the Akutagawa Prize, this famous literary award for Taiyo no Kisetsu. And this also led fame to other books that Ishihara wrote subsequently about similarly acting youth. There was a rise of what was called the Sun Tribe, or Taiyozoku. Taiyo again meaning sun. And it came from the title of Ishihara's award-winning book, Taiyo no Kisetsu. These are youth that are depicted as rich, bored, and vicious. Youth that have too much time, too much money, and too much sex. Youth that hate everything about their parents' generation and want to just trod on the old and bring in the new. But it's not representing like new as in like new intellectuals that are going to start highbrow like theories of how human beings should act. These are sort of very selfish youth. And they're often depicted with absent parents, like for example, fathers that work too much, mothers who aren't seen very much in the novels. We don't really get a view into the mother in Season of Violence. But again, please keep in mind that the Sun Tribe members lived a very different life than what was the reality for most people in Japan. Most people were not like this. One, they could not afford financially to be like this. The fad only lasted a few years, and the release of the first Sun Tribe film was timed to coincide with the awarding of the Akutagawa Prize. And all the Sun Tribe novels that Ishihara wrote were all turned into films, and many people got to know them through the films. Like you could think about how film promotes its original source novel. And I'm including stills from the films on my slides, and one of the most famous films was a film based not on the novel we're reading, but another Sun Tribe novel by Ishihara called Crazed Fruit. And I also assigned a short video about the violence and a depiction of youth in these Sun Tribe films. It's a fan-created video, but I think it's quite well done that maps out a lot of ways in which these Sun Tribe movies really not only changed literature, but changed film. As I mentioned, Ishihara used the mass media in an unprecedented way. He was able to use film, for example, to link to his literature. He was not the first person to have a novel made into a movie, please don't think that, but he was timing them in certain ways, and the strong influence of the Sun Tribe film. People were protesting movie theaters when these films came out, that these were too scandalous, and youth should not be allowed to watch these films. I don't know if you feel that way, having read the story. Again, it was a time of so-called middle-brow culture, that magazines, literature, film, not aimed at the super elite, the super intellectuals, and not aimed at people who are just looking for plain old trash. There's a lot of really good trashy literature that was written for pure entertainment at this point, like a lot of gruesome detective stories, stories about Japanese women marrying American military men, lots of different genre fiction, if you will, in the 1940s and 50s. But it was also a time when Ishihara's Season of Violence came out that weekly magazines were considered a form of news and entertainment, and they would include both scandals and literature. It's sort of sad today, like at least for me, when I'm looking for news, I go straight online and start Googling things. I do read some magazines, but magazines are not as influential in our society as they were in the 1950s. Magazines, it's not like everybody saved them and had huge piles of magazines in their houses that they treasured. Magazines were considered a disposable medium. So they were very affordable, easy to buy, and often shared among many people. But the Sun Tribe conveyed, as I've been mentioning, both the newness and the scandal, the excitement and the fears of this form of youth culture. And that's exciting for readers. Like, I don't know how you feel. Do you prefer to read stories about good people or bad people? This is a very wordy slide, and I won't read it all to you, but this is just to give us some ideas for our discussions together and for your discussion posts. These are some things that we could discuss in terms of the story's content and form. As I mentioned before, the Japanese title is Season of the Sun. Do you think the English title, Season of Violence, is a better fit? Why or why not? And again, you can think about the art of translation and publishing. Many of Ishihara Shintaro's novels were retranslated, especially after he became governor of Tokyo. But the translation we're reading is from 1961, and I assigned this on purpose for you to see an early translation of his work. You can also think about how the story depicts the historical context that we've discussed in today's lecture. And how does it also show general aspects of human nature that are so-called timeless? Like maybe you could think of like, do you know anybody that behaves like Tatsuya in the story or Eiko? Have you seen any like American films or television programs or other media that depict characters like Eiko and Tatsuya? There might be something that transcends the 1950s and crosses national boundaries to the characters in this story. And when you write stories, not always are the characters the most important element. But in this case, they are. This is a highly character-driven story. The characters are our focal point. We learn their points of perspective. This is not a story that's told by first-person narration. It's not a first-person narration means that the story is narrated like I. Like a sentence in first-person narration would be, I give a lecture. A story told in second-person narration would be you give a lecture, Y-O-U. A story told in third-person narration, he, she, it, they, would be Elisa gives a lecture. In this case, we have an omniscient third-person narrator. We have a narrator that is telling the story, but the narrator is also telling Tatsuya's thoughts. Like we're getting inside Tatsuya's head, which is also quite modern in the writing of Japanese literature. In other stories, not every story that we'll read together has such strong characters. Some of them privilege the setting, for example, over the characters, and we could discuss that. We could also discuss how these characters treat each other, and what is it that these characters value? How do they regard their family and friends? How do they regard their possessions? What about the gender roles? And again, that question that drives me a bit nuts with the story and many stories like it. Why does the female character always need a reason to be bad? Why can't she just be bad? Like, Tatsuya's just bad. Why can't she just be bad? Anyhow, we also see violence and sex and love. Why mention love in this story? Is this a love story? Or is love expressed in material terms? Why boxing? And this is thanks to a student. One student reminded me that even Captain America, there's boxing metaphors used. You can think about association with boxing and certain views toward masculinity. Like it might be a very different story, for example, if Tatsuya is a tennis player. Not that tennis is bad, but we have a lot of violence in his choice of sport. We also see fashions, places, and trends that are very much grounded in the 1950s. And the Sun Tribe films have a lot of jazz music, sort of the music of youth culture at this time. We also have images of foreigners, and the Japanese women, minor characters mentioned, sometimes take foreign names like Susie or Sally. This was not uncommon at this time. Again, this sort of fad for things American. Also in part because Japan had feared the worst with the occupation, thinking the Americans are going to come in and just destroy Japan in various ways. And there was, some people argue that after the war, Japan and America even got closer as allies. We also have images of hedonism and carpe diem, this kind of seizing of the moment, which we can discuss. Again, I don't mean to offend your readerly sensibilities, but we do have scenes of birth control in the story, or lack of birth control. Abortion through much of the 20th century was considered a means of birth control in Japan. It was not illegal, but birth control pills, oral contraceptives for women, were not legalized until 1999. If you're interested, I can post a history of Japanese contraceptives. But as you read the story, you can keep in mind that there's a different view of abortion than how we might view it in our era. That abortions would be considered a way of I guess to say contraception would be a bit wrong, but it would not be that unusual, scandalous, or illegal to have an abortion at this time. But it is very controversial that there's a female character in this story who is not priding motherhood or not seeing motherhood as a role for women in this time, as I mentioned, of the growing sort of codified norms of women in the family. We also see a Japanese funeral where we have the use of a photograph and incense, the photograph of the deceased. And keep in mind that most people in Japan were cremated, not buried. Lastly, were you surprised about the ending? Did it shock you, or did you expect it to end this way? No spoilers, you need to read the story. And for those of you fan fiction writers or creative writers, it might be a fun exercise to think about what happens after the story time. Like if you were to add another chapter, what would happen in it? Would the characters change? What would be the final scene if you were to write the story? Or do you think this is a good way to end the story? Is this the ending it should have? So I assigned the short video of Sun Tribe films. There were 3 Sun Tribe films, all released in 1956, but they had a lasting impact and tied well to the literature. All Ishihara Shintaro stories, all commercially successful. The Sun Tribe films also helped revive the Japanese film industry, which was trying to compete with television at the time. So a very successful film in 1954 in Japan was Godzilla, the use of kaiju or monsters to do something that television couldn't do. Here we have the Japanese film industry doing something else that that television couldn't do. Because television is meant to be watched in families, these films are showing scenes that are not so-called family appropriate. As I mentioned, there were protests against the films, and they also coincided with cautionary tales in the mass media. They starred young actors and actresses. Ishihara Shintaro also plays parts in his own movies. And if you're interested, here are some film posters. And Season of Violence was also released, the film was also released internationally under the title Juvenile Jungle, or Juvenile Passions abroad. The third Sun Tribe film was by a famous director at the time named Ichikawa Kon. This is Ishihara Shintaro's brother, Ishihara Yujiro, who played in the films. And Yujiro, too, has the same kind of super cropped hairstyle. He represents this athletic build. He has an attitude. He was promoted in Japanese magazines as the actor who could stand up to Americans. He was called the James Dean of Japan. And he married the woman who played Eiko, just a reminder. Sadly, Ishihara Yujiro died in 1987 of an aneurysm, and he's one of the most famous actors. If you go to Japan and you mention his name to people of an older generation, they'll know who you're talking about. So lastly, and my apologies, this is one of my longer lectures for you, but I hope you find it interesting. Ishihara Shintaro went on to become very active in Japanese politics. And when you think about it, Tokyo is the capital of Japan. It's the political capital. It's the cultural capital. Most books are published in Tokyo. It's the financial capital. It's where a lot of the big financial hubs are. Like in the United States, we have capitals that have different meanings, like our political capital being Washington, D.C., perhaps our financial capital being New York City. But in Japan, Tokyo is the capital for many different parts of Japanese influence. So to be the governor of Tokyo is a big deal. And Ishihara became known as one of the most nationalistic and right-wing politicians in Japanese history. I'm sorry to offend your sensibilities again, but he is known for making sexist and racist remarks, especially controversial statements against foreigners, against different kinds of sexualities, and against China in disputes of China in 2012. He started cleanup campaigns, for example, around Tokyo to get rid of things that he saw were unsavory. But he was also responsible for the 2020 Tokyo bid and for controversial legislation that tried to regulate manga, Japanese comics. Other than that, Ishihara really understood the relationship between literature and politics, and that's important for our class. We'll talk about how literature can be political, not only in its content and its form, but in its existence, in its art, in its circulation, how a literary work can really link up, and how an author's lives can be intrinsically tied to politics, as we'll see with Mishima soon. So again, like his brother was able to stand up to Western actors or American actors, Ishihara became sort of a tough guy being able to stand up to the United States and other so-called Western powers, even though we know the term Western simplistic. The world is not just divided between East and West. For example, Ishihara wrote a book in 1990 called The Japan That Can Say No, which talks about how Japan should say no to America and to other world powers and stand up for itself more to be a world dominant power. He also wrote a memoir about his brother, and as I mentioned, there have been translations of Ishihara's works that have been paid for by the Japanese government. This is not scandalous. There's several government-sponsored translation projects, but recirculating Ishihara's work was seen as politically important to understand 20th century Japan. He resigned as governor in 2012 to start a new wing of a right-wing political party named, as relevant to our lecture today, the Sun Party, after the Sun Tribe and our assigned story, Seasons of the Sun. I'm not going to read this slide aloud to you, and if you'd like it, again, at any time, you have the PowerPoints, you could pause and you could read them. These are some of Ishihara's literary works, if you'd like to read more. And for those of you interested in popular culture, Season of Violence has been made into a fairly contemporary or recent television drama starring boy band members. So thank you for listening. You learned a lot about the 5 variables that we're studying, the historical context of the 1950s, and the kind of youth culture that Season of Violence represents. You also learned about the author, Ishihara Shintaro, and here you see him pictured in his super cropped hair, along with our author for next week, Mishima Yukio. This is a photo taken in the 1950s. You learned what happened to Ishihara before and after he wrote Season of Violence. You also learned, we sort of got the conversation started about the content and form of Season of Violence and why the story was considered new, scandalous, and exciting, and dangerous. And why it won the name of Japan's most prestigious literary prize? Yeah, the Akutagawa Prize. And how the novel interacted within the cultural sphere of magazines and especially film at this moment. And you saw a bit of Sun Tribe films, not only in the film posters in my lecture, but also in the assigned video for today. So throughout this term, we'll continue to discuss what is considered prize-winning literature and publishing industries and how they construct views of Japanese fiction. In other words, we'll continue to discuss the significance, our 5th variable, of Season of Violence and how it has continued to shape Japanese literature even through today. We'll question, in turn, how prize-winning stories shape global images of Japan. Why was this story so famous that Season of Violence so famous that it made it into Time magazine or globally in the 1950s? Why did the film show internationally? Why do shocking stories win elite prizes? Should we read cruel stories of youth? Should we read stories full of sex violence and boxing? Why or why not? So thank you so much for listening, and I'm looking forward to discussing this story with you. Who became the youngest authors to win the prize in 2004. If we had time, I would have assigned Hebi ni Piyasu or Snakes and Earrings, Kanehara's novel from 2004, because it presents a really interesting image of subcultures in Tokyo. Wataru Risa's work is also quite beautiful, and it talks about 2 high school misfits. Of Japanese literature, the content and form of the story, the context, the author, and significance. So if you notice the photos on the top margin, these are images of Tokyo in the 1950s. You see that Tokyo looks very different, fortunately, than Nagasaki did in 1945 after the bombing. In the 1950s, Japan is recovering from the war. As depicted in literature, many people still suffered. There were still shortages of housing. People are still trying to make ends meet, if you will, financially, but the Japanese economy is starting to get better in the mid 1950s. What you see in the photo to the right, that half-built tower is one of the most famous landmarks in Tokyo. It's Tokyo Tower, that's still around today. And Tokyo Tower was completed in 1958, in part as a symbol of Tokyo's rise from the wartime ashes. Very, very quickly, because this is a class on literature, I'm just giving us context so that we could understand how the literary work functions within its larger cultural sphere. And many of the works that I assign react to their historical context, as does this one. So I just like to go over some events. So the Allied occupation, which was led by the United States under General MacArthur, the Supreme Commander of the Allied Powers, or SCAP, lasted in Japan from 1945 to 1952. This was a time where, for example, Japan's new constitution was ratified in 1947. And this is a constitution that promoted more aspects of sort of American-style democracy. For example, Japan's Constitution of 1947 includes an article declaring that men and women, again, this kind of binary gendered thinking of the 1950s, that men and women are equal under law. The United States doesn't have an equal gender amendment in our Constitution, Equal Rights Amendment. This, unfortunately, was not ratified in the 1980s in the United States. But in the Japanese Constitution, we see sort of the passage of certain American democracy programs. The United States, and I could give you more information about this if you'd like to learn more, but the United States was sort of guiding Japan through some changes that would change what the American government thought was sort of feudal beliefs in Japan that had caused the war. Like beliefs in the emperor as the symbol of the homeland. And after the war, the emperor is considered as just a symbolic figurehead of the head of the nation. The emperor, in fact, is not a very wealthy man. And we know that an emperor can never be a woman. Unlike the Queen of England, who is quite wealthy, the emperor is now a symbolic figurehead. Please keep that in mind for the next slide. It's just a preview. But the Constitution of 1947 included an Article 9, which declared that that Japan could not commit offensive war. Japan does have a self-defense force, a jietai, and in 1951, the United States and Japan signed a security treaty which allowed for American military bases and other American military influences in Japan. So in short, and again, I'd be happy to give you more information about this, America was cultivating Japan as sort of an ally against the rising tide of communism in Asia. This is the start of the Cold War. And United States was starting programs that showed sort of the ideas of American liberal democracy in the 1950s. It's also a time in Japan of the rise of what's called the LDP, or the governing political party in Japan that has been in power for much of the 20th century. The LDP is a name, if you go to Japan, you'll hear LDP as one of the major political parties. If anyone understands Japanese politics, please explain it to me. There's always so many different parties, but the LDP has been around for a long time, and it's the most conservative and right-wing political party, and it has had the support of the United States. Some people have theory that the LDP was supported in part by the United States CIA. And Ishihara Shintaro is a member of the LDP, and he was one of many sort of Japanese celebrities in the 1950s and 60s that began to enter politics. In the 1950s, especially around the time of the Korean War, the Japanese economy began to recover, in part because there were a rise of Japanese hard industries, like the manufacturing of radios, machinery, and new technologies like transistors. Japan also began to build up an export economy. And Japan supplied machinery to the United States and for fighting during the Korean War. The unprecedented economic growth from around 1952 to the mid 1970s is often called by historians the Japan's high growth era. This era is also marked by a lot of urbanization. Big cities like Tokyo began to grow. And one event that marked the rise of Japan from the ashes of the war and showed the new prosperity and recovery was the 1964 Tokyo Olympics. We'll go more into this history next week, but I just want to give you some information to better understand this week's story. We have a rapid advance also in the 1950s in Japan and also in many parts of the world, including the United States, of the advance of what's called commodity capitalism. The sort of desire to buy new things that represent a happy middle class life. Like, for example, in a lot of Japanese media in the 1950s, there was a description of what was called the three treasures, namely owning a television, owning a refrigerator, and having a washing machine. The idea that having these appliances would bring about a happy, easier life. We will discuss materialism and love in Season of Violence. And when you read the story, the characters mention yen. For example, the brothers make a bet about 5,000 yen. That's an extreme amount of money. This is a time where yen was standardized at 360 yen to $1, but 5,000 yen would be a huge amount of money. Readers of the story in the 1950s would be shocked by this. 20,000 yen, that's a lot of money. As I mentioned, there was a growth of cities at this moment, and the Season of Violence is set about an hour and a half outside of Tokyo in an affluent area of Japan near Zushi Beach. But more people are moving to Tokyo, especially youth from the countryside who were not like the characters in the Season of Violence. Many of the youth who came to Tokyo did so for jobs, or did so because there was more opportunities for them in work and education than in the countryside. And you could see scenes from documentaries from the 1950s of these packed trains of youth moving into Tokyo from the countryside to go to work at the new factories that are manufacturing radios, cars, machinery. It's implied that Tatsuya and Michihisa, the two brothers in the story, that their father works in Tokyo. And we know he's an upper-class businessman because he rides in a first-class car. I mentioned, too, that this is also a rise of sort of a leisure, not that people had a ton of free time, but there's a rise of leisure culture in certain ways. For example, there's a rise of what's called middle-brow magazines, magazines aimed at sort of middle-class, mid-level readers, magazines that are not too intellectual but not too dumbed down either, like sort of general consumption magazines that would be entertaining and fun to read. There's sort of a rise of fashion. Fashion, again, at this time is different from like what we buy today. Like there's so many Uniqlo, a big fast fashion shop around Tokyo today, but that kind of consumption of being able to buy 16 t-shirts at really cheap cost was not what was going on at this point, but people could buy more clothing. We see in the story, for example, affluent Western-style dresses. Not everyone's wearing kimono, and the fact in the story that Eiko showed up at the boxing match in kimono is striking. Japanese people are wearing Western-style clothes, in part because Western-style clothes are more practical, but they didn't own tons of things. I hope I'm making sense. I'm going over a lot of context, but we can unpack it in terms of the story.